The stars had never seemed so cold as they did on that morning when the alien ships arrived. Admiral Jack Morrison stood at the observation window of the defense station orbiting Earth and watched the massive vessels emerge from the darkness of space like predators stepping into firelight. They were enormous things made of dark metal that seemed to drink in the light around them, and their hulls were covered in markings that meant nothing to human eyes but spoke of conquest and blood across 47 star systems. The Kratheon Empire had sent its emissaries, and everyone who saw those ships knew exactly what message they carried. Commander Lisa Grant stood beside Morrison with her arms crossed tight against her chest and her eyes fixed on the tactical screens that showed hundreds more ships gathering just beyond visual range. She had studied every report from the colonies that had encountered the Kratheon before, and none of those encounters had ended well for anyone who stood in their way. The Empire crushed resistance without mercy and enslaved entire populations and left dead worlds in their wake as warnings to others who might think about saying no to their demands. Down on Earth in the emergency command center buried deep beneath what used to be Washington, President Henry Walsh watched the same feeds with a room full of military advisors and scientists and diplomats who all looked like they had aged 10 years in the past 3 hours. The alien transmission had come through on every frequency humanity used and in perfect English, which meant they had been watching and studying and preparing for this moment for a long time. The voice that delivered the message was cold and mechanical and completely without emotion, as it explained that humanity had 72 hours to surrender completely or face total annihilation. The Kratheon representative appeared on screens around the world, and its reptilian form towered over the camera with scales that reflected light like polished bronze and eyes that were vertical slits of pure black. It spoke with absolute certainty about the fate of species that refused the Empire's generous offer of subjugation and showed images of burning cities and populations being herded into transport, ships and worlds reduced to lifeless rocks floating in space. This was not a negotiation, and there would be no second chances, and humanity needed to understand that. Resistance was not just futile but actively stupid. Walsh dismissed most of his advisors after 6 hours of argument that went in circles and kept only the people he trusted most. General Nathan Cole, who commanded Earth's combined military forces, stood at the tactical table with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth might crack. Dr. Karen Phillips, who ran the weapons development program out in Nevada, sat with her hands folded on top of classified files that contained humanity's last desperate hopes. Ambassador Claire Hoffman, who had spent 20 years in diplomatic service to the colonies, looked exhausted and defeated as she explained, again, that talking to the Kratheon would accomplish nothing because they did not negotiate with species they considered inferior. Morrison received orders to begin defensive preparations, but everyone knew the numbers made no sense. Humanity had maybe 200 ships that could be called combat vessels, and most of those were freighters with weapons bolted onto their hulls or mining ships that had been converted into makeshift destroyers. The Kratheon had brought thousands of warships that were designed for nothing but killing and conquering, and they had technology that was centuries ahead of anything humanity had managed to build in its short time among the stars. Captain Greg Sullivan got the call while his ship, the UES Vengeance, was docked at the lunar shipyards for what was supposed to be routine maintenance. He watched his crew scramble to load weapon systems that were still in testing phases and ammunition that might or might not work properly, and he thought about his daughter back on Earth, who was 7 years old and believed her father could fix anything. Sullivan had fought in colonial conflicts and border skirmishes and pirate raids, but nothing had prepared him for the sick feeling in his stomach as he looked at the alien fleet through his view screen and understood that this might be the last time he ever saw his home world. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez worked in the weapons bay alongside the loading crews and tried not to think about the fact that the quantum disruptors they were installing had never been fired. Outside of controlled laboratory conditions, Dr. Phillips had sent technical specifications with warnings that covered 3 pages about all the things that could go wrong if the weapons were used improperly, but nobody had time to worry about safety. Protocols when extinction was the alternative. Rodriguez had joined the military because her family had a tradition of service going back 5 generations, but she had never imagined she would be loading experimental weapons to fight aliens that wanted to enslave her entire species. Luna Base Commander Nick Harper drilled his fighter pilots until they could barely stand because he knew that Drill time now might save their lives in the coming battle. His pilots were young and eager and terrified. In equal measure, and Harper pushed them harder than he had ever pushed anyone because the Kratheon had already killed his wife and son when they destroyed the research station on Titan 3 months ago. That attack had been a scouting run and a message about what would happen to humanity if they did not submit, and Harper had spent every day since then preparing for the chance to make the aliens pay for what they had taken from him. Sergeant Claire Dawson assembled her Marine unit on the orbital platform designated Station 7 and briefed them on defensive procedures for repelling boarding actions. Her troops checked their weapons and armor and tried to joke about the situation the way soldiers always did when they were scared, but nobody could quite manage to make it sound convincing. Dawson had served for 12 years and seen combat on 3 different worlds, but fighting human enemies was completely different from fighting aliens that stood 8 feet tall and had natural armor, plating, and could tear through steel doors with their bare claws. President Walsh made his decision in the quiet hours of the morning when most of Earth was asleep. He had listened to all the arguments for surrender and understood the logic that said humanity could not win this fight and should preserve what lives they could by accepting the Empire's terms. But Walsh also understood that surrender meant the end of everything humanity had built and the destruction of the freedom that defined what it meant to be human, and he could not bring himself to condemn his species to slavery just to buy a few more years of existence as subjects rather than as free people. The transmission went out on all frequencies in every language humanity spoke, and Walsh delivered it himself from the command center with the flags of Earth's nations behind him and exhaustion in his eyes. He told the Kratheon Empire that humanity rejected their ultimatum and would not surrender and would fight to defend their freedom no matter what the cost. He told his own people that the coming days would test everything they believed about themselves, and that many would die, but that they would die as free human beings, rather than as slaves to an alien empire. Dr. Phillips received authorization to begin mass production of the quantum disruptors, and every weapons facility on Earth and Mars and the Belt colonies shifted into full production mode. The devices were dangerous and unstable and might kill the people using them as easily as they killed the enemy, but they were the only advantage humanity had, and Phillips pushed her teams to work faster than they had ever worked before. She had not slept in 2 days and had no intention of sleeping until every ship in the fleet carried the new weapons, because her calculations showed that without them humanity had exactly 0 chance of survival. Morrison assembled his fleet in high orbit above Earth and broadcast final orders to every ship captain in the Defense Force. They would not retreat and would not scatter, and would not surrender no matter how bad things got, because running would only delay the inevitable, and humanity needed to show the Kratheon that they would fight for every inch of space around their home. The Admiral looked at his tactical display, showing 200 human ships against thousands of alien vessels, and allowed himself one moment to acknowledge how insane this plan was before pushing that thought away and focusing on the battle to come. Sullivan stood on the bridge of the Vengeance as the countdown entered its final hours and watched his crew move through their duties with grim determination. Rodriguez had the weapon systems ready and reported green lights across all the disruptor arrays, and the rest of the crew checked and rechecked every system on the ship until there was nothing left to do but wait. Sullivan opened a channel to all hands and told them what he believed with his whole heart, which was that humanity had always achieved the impossible and today would be no different. The Kratheon fleet moved into attack formation exactly on schedule because the Empire did everything with precision and had planned this assault down to the smallest detail. Their ships were massive and powerful and carried weapons that could crack planets, and their commanders were confident that this would be over quickly because no species had ever successfully resisted the Empire once the Armada was deployed. They were about to learn that humanity specialized in doing things that should have been impossible. The 72 hours that followed the rejection of surrender transformed every corner of human civilization into a machine built for one purpose, which was war. Factories that had produced consumer goods for peaceful markets retooled their assembly lines to manufacture weapons and armor and ammunition at rates that should have been impossible, but somehow happened anyway, because people worked in shifts that never ended, and nobody complained about overtime or safety regulations when extinction was the alternative. Shipyards on Earth and Luna and Mars and the asteroid colonies ran at maximum capacity with workers welding hull plates and installing weapon systems and conducting repairs that normally would have taken weeks, but now had to be finished in hours. Commander Lisa Grant worked without sleep for 2 straight days, coordinating the defensive positions of every ship and station in Earth's orbital space, because someone had to organize the chaos and make sure that when the fighting started there was actually a plan instead of just panic. She drank coffee that tasted like motor oil and ate protein bars that had the texture of cardboard and stared at tactical displays until the numbers blurred together. But she kept working, because stopping meant thinking about what was coming, and thinking meant fear. And fear was a luxury nobody could afford right now. Down on Earth, the recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers who wanted to fight or serve, or do anything that might help because humanity had never been good at accepting defeat without a struggle. Young people who had never considered. Military service stood in lines that stretched for blocks and demanded to be given weapons and training, and a chance to defend their world. Old veterans who had thought their fighting days were finished came out of retirement and reported for duty with gray hair and bad knees, and absolute determination to stand with their species one more time. Captain Greg Sullivan watched the loading crews work on the Vengeance and marveled at how fast they moved when properly motivated by the prospect of alien invasion. The quantum disruptors were massive devices that took up twice as much space as conventional weapons and required cooling systems that seemed unnecessarily complicated. But Dr. Phillips had assured him they would work, and Sullivan had to trust that because he had no other options. His crew ran endless drills on the new systems and practiced firing sequences until they could operate the weapons in their sleep, because muscle memory might save their lives when conscious thought became impossible in the chaos of combat. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez spent hours going over the technical specifications for the quantum disruptors and trying to understand exactly how they worked, because she believed that knowing your weapons was the difference between life and death. The physics involved were far beyond her training, but the basic principle seemed simple enough, which was that the disruptors destabilized the molecular bonds in whatever they hit and caused catastrophic structural failure. The problem was that the weapons were temperamental and required precise calibration, and could theoretically malfunction in ways that would be very bad for the ship firing them. But Rodriguez decided not to think too hard about that part. On Luna Base, Commander Nick Harper pushed his pilots through training exercises that left them exhausted and angry, and better prepared than they had any right to be given the limited time available. He taught them tricks he had learned in 20 years of combat flying and emphasized the importance of staying calm when everything was exploding around them, and drilled into their heads that their job was not to be heroes but to complete their missions and stay alive. Harper knew that most of these kids would probably die in the coming battle, but he refused to accept that all of them would die, and if his brutal training saved even one life, then it was worth the hatred they felt toward him right now. The fighter. Squadrons practiced attack runs against simulated Kratheon dreadnoughts using every scrap of intelligence humanity had managed to gather about the Empire's ship designs. The aliens favored heavy armor and powerful shields, but their vessels were not particularly maneuverable, which meant small fast fighters might be able to exploit weaknesses that larger ships could not reach. Harper organized his squadrons into strike groups that could coordinate their attacks and overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numbers and precision timing, and he made them practice the maneuvers until they could execute them perfectly, even when half the squadron was simulated. As destroyed, Sergeant Claire Dawson drilled her Marines on Station 7 in close-quarters combat techniques, because if the Kratheon managed to board the platform, then conventional weapons might not be enough against enemies that were bigger and stronger and naturally armored. She taught her troops how to use explosives in confined spaces, and how to target weak points in alien anatomy, and how to keep fighting even when wounded, because giving up meant death not just for themselves, but for everyone depending on them to hold the line. Dawson had seen what the Kratheon did to populations they conquered, and she had no intention of letting that happen to Earth. President Walsh addressed the world in a speech that was broadcast on every channel and translated into every language, and he spoke plainly about what was coming. He did not sugarcoat the odds or promise easy victory, or pretend that everything would be fine because people deserved honesty about what they were facing. Walsh told his species that many would die, and that the coming battle would be brutal, beyond anything humanity had experienced before, but that the alternative to fighting was surrender, and surrender meant the end of everything they valued. He asked people to be brave and to trust in each other, and to remember that humanity had always found ways to survive when survival seemed impossible. Dr. Karen Phillips worked in her laboratory with a team of scientists and engineers who shared her desperate determination to give humanity every possible advantage. The quantum disruptors were being mass-produced now, but Phillips was already working on the next generation of weapons and defensive systems, because she knew the Krathion would adapt to whatever humanity threw at them. She had proposals for mine, fields that could be deployed in orbital space and missile systems that could overwhelm enemy point defenses and experimental shield technology that might deflect energy weapons, but all of it required time that nobody had and resources that were already stretched to the breaking point. Admiral Jack Morrison received constant updates about the Krathion fleet movements and watched as the alien armada organized itself into attack formations that demonstrated centuries of military experience. The Empire's commanders were not rushing or taking chances, but were instead preparing methodically for an assault they clearly expected to be routine. Morrison studied the enemy formations and looked for weaknesses or patterns he could exploit, but the Krathion did not make obvious mistakes, and their defensive positions were textbook perfect, which meant humanity would have to create opportunities rather than exploit existing ones. The Admiral called a meeting of all ship captains and station commanders and laid out the battle plan that had been developed by Earth's best military minds working together. It was risky and would require split-second timing, and assumed that the quantum disruptors would perform exactly as advertised, but it was the best plan they had. Morrison explained that humanity's only advantage was surprise because the Krathion expected conventional weapons and tactics and had no idea what the disruptors could do. The plan required the human fleet to engage at close range, where the alien advantages in numbers and firepower would be partially negated, and where the disruptors would be most effective. Sullivan listened to Morrison's briefing and understood that close range meant his ship would be directly in the line of fire from dozens of enemy vessels. But he also understood that staying at distance meant certain defeat, because the Krathion could simply pound the human fleet into scrap with superior numbers. The Vengeance would be part of the first attack wave, which meant they would take the worst of the enemy fire, but would also have the best chance of causing significant damage before the Krathion could adapt to the new weapons. Sullivan looked at his crew and saw fear in their eyes, but also determination, and he knew they would follow him into whatever hell was waiting. Harper briefed his pilots on their role in the attack and explained that the fighter squadrons would target the enemy command ships in an attempt to disrupt Krathion communications and coordination. It was a suicide mission in everything but name, because the fighters would have to penetrate deep into the enemy formation, past overlapping defensive fire from hundreds of vessels. Harper did not apologize for asking them to do this, and did not offer false hope, but instead told them plainly that their sacrifice might buy the fleet precious minutes to exploit the confusion, and that sometimes that was all that mattered in war. Dawson walked through the corridors of Station 7 and checked on her troops and made sure everyone understood their assignments. The platform was equipped with heavy cannons that would provide fire support for the fleet, but it was also likely to become a target for Krathion boarding parties because the aliens would want to neutralize the orbital defenses. Dawson had positioned her Marines at every critical junction and established fallback positions in case sections of the station were lost, and prepared demolition charges. The Krathion armada moved with the confidence of a force that had crushed 47 civilizations and never once encountered real resistance, because the Empire's reputation usually broke enemy morale before the first shot was fired. Their massive dreadnoughts formed the center of the formation, with cruisers and destroyers arranged in overlapping defensive layers that could concentrate fire on any threat from any direction. The alien commanders watched the pathetically small human fleet approach and probably felt something like pity for these primitive creatures who were about to learn why resistance was futile. Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched his tactical display count down the distance between the two fleets. His hand hovered over the communications panel, and his voice was steady despite the fear that tried to crawl up his throat when he gave the order that would start the battle. Every ship captain in the human fleet heard the same words, which were simple and direct and meant that there was no turning back now. Morrison told them to engage, and the human fleet accelerated forward in a maneuver that was so aggressive and reckless that the Krathion sensors probably registered it as a malfunction because no sane military force would charge directly into overwhelming enemy fire. Captain Greg Sullivan felt the Vengeance shudder as the engines pushed to maximum power, and the ship dove toward the alien formation like a missile aimed at the heart of the enemy fleet. Around him on the bridge, his crew worked with focused intensity, and nobody spoke except to call out system status reports because everyone understood that talking would not change what was about to happen. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez had her hands on the weapons controls, and her eyes fixed on the targeting computer, and she waited for the moment when the Krathion ships would come into range of the quantum disruptors. The alien fleet opened fire first, because they had longer range weapons and they probably assumed that destroying the human ships at distance would be easier than letting them get close. Space lit up with energy beams and plasma bolts and missile trails that streaked across the darkness like shooting stars, but the human ships kept coming and twisted through the incoming fire with maneuvers that sacrificed formation discipline for survival. 3 human destroyers exploded in the first 30 seconds of combat, and their crews died without ever firing a shot. But the rest of the fleet pushed forward and closed the distance. Sullivan saw the targeting display light up green as the lead. Krathion cruisers came into range and he shouted for Rodriguez to fire. The quantum disruptors unleashed beams of destabilized energy that looked like purple lightning and moved at the speed of light and hit the alien shields with force that should not have been possible from weapons of that size. The Krathion shields flickered and died, and the beams punched through the hull armor like it was paper, and the cruiser came apart in a brilliant explosion that sent debris spinning in all directions. Rodriguez stared at her screens in shock for half a second before training took over, and she locked onto the next target and fired again. Another Krathion ship died, and then another, and suddenly the human fleet was tearing through the alien formation and leaving burning wrecks in their wake. The disruptors were working better than anyone had dared to hope, and for a brief moment it seemed like humanity might actually have a chance. But the Krathion were not stupid, and they adapted quickly to the new threat. Their fleet commanders recognized that the human weapons were somehow bypassing their shields, and they ordered immediate tactical changes that spread the formation wider and rotated fresh ships to the front, while damaged vessels fell back. The aliens had hundreds of ships, and losing a dozen was annoying but not critical, and they began concentrating fire on individual human vessels to overwhelm them through sheer volume of attacks. The UES Defiance took hits that shook the entire ship, and Morrison felt the deck shift under his feet as explosions tore through the lower decks. Damage reports flooded in from every section, and the tactical display showed human ships disappearing from the formation at an alarming rate. For every Krathion vessel they destroyed, humanity lost 3 ships, and the mathematics of that exchange rate meant defeat was inevitable unless something changed fast. Commander Nick Harper led his fighter squadrons into the chaos of the main battle and immediately lost 4 pilots to defensive fire from the alien cruisers. The fighters were tiny compared to the capital ships around them, and they used that size advantage to weave through the crossfire and launch missile salvos at vulnerable points on the Krathion dreadnoughts. Harper had targeted the alien flagship because killing the command ship might disrupt enemy coordination and buy the human fleet precious seconds to exploit the confusion. The fighters screamed through space faster than the big ships could track, and they dumped countermeasures that confused enemy targeting systems and created windows of opportunity, measured in fractions of seconds. Harper locked missiles onto the flagship's command tower and fired everything he had, and watched his squadron do the same. Dozens of missiles converged on the target from multiple angles and overwhelmed the point defense systems, and at least 6 warheads got through and detonated against the armored tower in a series of explosions that gutted the structure. The Krathion flagship began to list as its navigation systems failed and secondary explosions rippled through its hull. But Harper did not have time to celebrate, because enemy fighters were on his squadron now. The alien pilots were good, and their ships were fast, and Harper lost 3 more pilots in the dogfight that erupted around the crippled flagship. He twisted through a series of evasive maneuvers that would have torn apart a less experienced pilot, and managed to get on the tail of an enemy fighter and blow it apart with cannon fire. Back on Station 7, Sergeant Claire Dawson felt the platform shake as Krathion weapons hammered the orbital defenses with concentrated fire that was designed to eliminate the heavy cannons that were supporting the human fleet. Sections of the station depressurized when plasma bolts punched through the hull, and alarms wailed throughout the corridors. Dawson led her Marines in a desperate effort to seal the breaches and evacuate the damaged sections, but the station was taking too much damage too fast, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the structure failed completely. The heavy cannons on the station kept firing even as the platform came apart around them, and the gunners stayed at their posts because running would not save them anyway. Dawson saw one of her Marines dragging a wounded crew member toward safety, and she grabbed the other side, and together they hauled the injured man through a hatch just before an explosion sealed the corridor behind them. The wounded man was missing his left arm and going into shock, but Dawson had no time to treat him properly, so she used emergency sealant to stop the bleeding and told him to stay put while she went to check on her other troops. The battle had been raging for less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours because time does strange things during combat when every second could be your last. Sullivan watched his tactical display and realized with sick certainty that the human fleet was losing despite the effectiveness of the quantum disruptors. The Kratheon had too many ships, and they were starting to coordinate their attacks better now that they understood the threat. 3 alien dreadnoughts concentrated fire on the Vengeance, and Sullivan felt his ship buckle under the assault. Rodriguez kept firing the disruptors even as systems failed around her, and coolant leaked from broken pipes and the lights flickered on and off. She destroyed 2 more enemy ships before a direct hit knocked out the primary weapons array, and she had to switch to manual control on the secondary systems. The backup disruptors were not properly calibrated, and they overheated dangerously, but Rodriguez kept firing them anyway because stopping meant dying, and she was not ready to die yet. Morrison made the hardest decision of his life and ordered the fleet to fall back toward the orbital platforms where they could use the station defenses to create a more defensible position. It was an admission that the initial attack had failed and that humanity needed a new strategy, but staying in the open space meant watching his fleet get picked apart piece by piece. The surviving human ships began a fighting retreat and tried to maintain formation while under constant fire from pursuing Kratheon vessels. Harper saw the retreat order come through, and he cursed because his squadron was deep in enemy territory, and pulling back meant running a gauntlet through the entire alien fleet. He rallied the surviving fighters and led them on a high-speed run through the chaos, while enemy fire chased them and picked off stragglers. Harper lost 2 more pilots on the retreat, and he watched their icons disappear from his tactical display, and he added their names to the list of people he would avenge before this was over. Dawson watched through the station viewports as human ships fell back toward the orbital platforms with Kratheon vessels in pursuit, and she understood that the battle was coming to her whether she was ready or not. She ordered her Marines to defensive positions around the docking bays because if the aliens decided to board the station, then this was where they would come. Her troops checked their weapons one more time and settled into cover behind barricades made from whatever materials they could find. The protocol had been conceived during the darkest planning sessions, when military analysts ran simulation after simulation, and every scenario ended with humanity's defeat, unless something radical changed the equation. Dr. Karen Phillips had proposed it almost as a joke because the idea seemed insane, but President Henry Walsh had authorized development anyway, because insane ideas were sometimes the only ones that worked. The protocol networked every nuclear weapon on Earth with every fusion reactor, and every antimatter storage facility, and every weapons platform scattered throughout the solar system into a single coordinated strike package that would turn humanity's home system into a weapon itself. Phillips sat in her bunker command center 3 miles beneath the surface of Colorado and watched her screens fill with green status indicators as systems came online across the planet and throughout near-Earth space. Her hands moved across them, controls with practiced efficiency, because she had run this simulation 1,000 times but never thought she would actually execute it for real. The protocol required precise timing because all the weapons had to detonate simultaneously to create the desired effect, and even a few seconds of deviation would reduce effectiveness dramatically. Admiral Jack Morrison received confirmation that the protocol was ready, and he broadcast new orders to what remained of his fleet. The human ships began pulling back from their defensive positions around the orbital platforms and creating distance between themselves and the Kratheon armada. The alien commanders probably thought this was the beginning of a full retreat, and They pressed their advantage by advancing their formation to maintain contact with the fleeing human vessels. Morrison watched the enemy ships move exactly where he needed them to be, and he gave Phillips the authorization code to activate the protocol. Across Earth and throughout the inner solar system, thousands of missiles rose from silos that had been hidden in mountains and deserts and beneath oceans. Submarines surfaced and opened their launch tubes and sent their deadly cargo skyward. Space stations that had seemed like ordinary civilian facilities revealed weapons bays that had been concealed behind false panels. Automated platforms scattered throughout the asteroid belt activated and began firing their payloads toward predetermined coordinates that formed a sphere around the Kratheon fleet. The Kratheon sensors detected the missile launches immediately, and their defensive systems activated to intercept the incoming weapons. But there were too many missiles coming from too many directions. The alien commanders probably assumed this was a desperate last strike by a defeated enemy, and they prepared to shoot down the warheads before they could reach the fleet. What they did not understand was that the missiles were not aimed at the fleet itself, but at carefully calculated points surrounding the fleet that would create a specific geometric pattern. The missiles reached their destinations and detonated, in perfect synchronization because Phillips had calculated the timing down to microseconds. Nuclear fire bloomed across hundreds of points in space and created a sphere of destruction that engulfed the entire orbital zone around Earth. The electromagnetic pulse from the simultaneous detonations was massive enough to be detected from neighboring star systems, and it washed over the Kratheon fleet like an invisible wave that fried electronic systems and disrupted power generation, and left hundreds of alien ships dead in space. The blast wave followed microseconds behind the EMP, and it hit the Kratheon formation with kinetic force that sent vessels tumbling out of control and slamming into each other in catastrophic collisions. Ships that had been maintaining precise formation spacing suddenly found themselves crashing into their neighbors as navigation systems failed and engines cut out. The carefully organized armada dissolved into chaos as captains tried desperately to regain control of vessels that no longer responded to commands. Morrison did not wait for the confusion to clear before giving the order to attack. The human fleet surged forward through the expanding cloud of nuclear fire and debris, and their quantum disruptors found easy targets among the disabled Kratheon vessels. Captain Greg Sullivan brought the Vengeance into weapons range of a drifting alien dreadnought, and Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez fired their remaining disruptor charge directly into the exposed reactor core. The dreadnought exploded with enough force to destroy two neighboring ships that were too close and could not maneuver away. Commander Nick Harper led his surviving fighter squadrons through the chaos, and his pilots showed no mercy to the helpless enemy vessels. They strafed crippled ships with cannon fire and launched missiles at disabled targets, and generally wreaked havoc among the Kratheon forces. Harper himself destroyed 4 alien frigates that were trying to restart their engines and failing, because the EMP had burned out critical systems that could not be quickly replaced. He felt a savage satisfaction with each kill, because these were the same aliens who had murdered his family. The Kratheon fleet tried to reorganize, but Morrison did not give them time to recover. He ordered his ships to target the vessels that still had operational weapons and eliminate them before they could coordinate a defense. The human fleet moved through the debris field like sharks among wounded prey, and the quantum disruptors carved through disabled alien ships with brutal efficiency. For every human vessel that fell to the still operational Kratheon weapons, humanity destroyed 5 enemy ships, and the exchange rate finally shifted in their favor. Sergeant Claire Dawson watched from Station 7 as the space around Earth transformed into a graveyard of burning ships and expanding debris clouds. The platform had taken severe damage during the earlier fighting, but it was still functional, and the heavy cannons continued firing at any Kratheon vessel that came within range. Dawson coordinated damage control teams while also preparing for possible boarding actions, because some of the alien ships were close enough that survivors might attempt to take refuge on the human stations. Her prediction proved correct when a damaged Kratheon cruiser lost all power and drifted toward Station 7 on a collision course that would have destroyed both vessels if not for emergency maneuvering thrusters that pushed the station clear. The cruiser passed close enough that Dawson could see the alien crew through viewports, and she raised her rifle instinctively, even though they could not possibly reach her. The cruiser tumbled away into the darkness, and Dawson felt no pity for The creatures inside because they had come here to enslave her world. Sullivan pushed the Vengeance hard and the ship responded despite damage that should have rendered it inoperable because his crew refused to let minor problems like hull breaches and coolant leaks stop them from fighting. Rodriguez had switched to conventional weapons after the last disruptor burned out, but she kept firing at anything that moved and her targeting was accurate enough that she rarely wasted ammunition. The bridge crew worked with the smooth coordination of people who had trained together for years and trusted each other completely. Harper ran out of missiles after his 7th kill, and he switched to cannon fire for the remaining engagements. The cannons were less effective against capital ships, but they could still do damage to disabled vessels that had lost their armor integrity. Harper coordinated his squadron to focus fire on critical systems like engines and weapons arrays, and life support and his pilots executed the attacks with precision that came from constant drilling. They had lost so many friends in this battle that revenge was a powerful motivator. The Crathion fleet began to break apart as individual captains made the decision to save their own ships rather than continue fighting a losing battle. Some vessels managed to restore enough power to engage their faster-than-light drives, and they jumped away from the system without waiting for orders. Others tried to surrender by broadcasting ceasefire requests on all frequencies, but Morrison had not forgotten the images of conquered worlds that the Crathion had shown during their ultimatum, and he ordered his fleet to show the same mercy the Empire had shown to others, which was none. Phillips monitored the battle from her bunker and watched the tactical displays show the Crathion formation collapsing into scattered groups of survivors trying desperately to escape. She had calculations running that predicted final casualty, counts and strategic outcomes, and all of them showed the same conclusion, which was that humanity had won against odds that should have made victory impossible. She felt exhausted and sick and triumphant all at the same time, because the protocol had worked but the cost had been enormous. The fighting continued for another 6 hours, as human forces hunted down the scattered remnants of the Crathion fleet and destroyed any ship that tried to regroup or counterattack. Morrison ordered his vessels to focus on enemy command ships and carriers, because eliminating their ability to coordinate would make the cleanup easier. The quantum disruptors were mostly burned out now, but conventional weapons were sufficient. Against ships that had lost their shields and armor integrity, Sullivan finally received orders to stand down when his ship was running on emergency power and had expended all ammunition except for point defense rounds. The Vengeance limped back toward Station 7, trailing atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches, and Rodriguez reported that they had maybe 15 minutes of life support remaining before the news of what happened at Earth spread across the galaxy, faster than anyone expected because information traveled at the speed of trade routes and merchant vessels, and every species that heard the story reacted with shock that humanity had survived. The Crathion Empire tried to suppress the truth by claiming they had achieved a strategic victory and withdrawn by choice, but too many witnesses existed and too much evidence remained for the lie to hold. Humanity had faced the Empire's grand armada and defeated it through courage and innovation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of his heavily damaged flagship 3 days after the battle and looked out at the debris field that surrounded Earth. Thousands of destroyed ships from both sides drifted in orbital space and created navigation hazards that would take years to clear. Rescue teams were still searching the wreckage for survivors and finding mostly bodies, but occasionally they pulled someone living from the ruins, and those small victories kept everyone motivated. Morrison had barely slept since the fighting ended because there was too much work organizing repairs and coordinating relief efforts and planning for whatever came next. Commander Lisa Grant worked alongside Morrison to establish new defensive positions because nobody believed the Crathion would simply accept their defeat and move on. She coordinated with the surviving ship captains to create patrol routes that would provide early warning if another alien fleet appeared, and she pushed the repair crews to prioritize weapon systems over creature comforts because being comfortable would not matter if they lost the next battle. Grant had lost friends during the fighting, and she channeled her grief into productive anger that drove her to work harder than should have been humanly possible. Captain Greg Sullivan and his crew spent days conducting emergency repairs on the Vengeance because the ship had taken damage that would normally require a shipyard, but the yards were all occupied with vessels in even worse condition. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez worked with engineering teams to salvage functional components from destroyed ships and install them on the Vengeance in makeshift configurations that violated every safety regulation ever written. The ship would never be pretty again, but it would fly and fight, and that was all that mattered. President Henry Walsh authorized the transmission that would become humanity's statement to the galaxy, and he assigned Commander Lisa Grant to deliver it because she had been there for the entire battle, and her words would carry weight. Grant stood on the damaged bridge of the Defiance, surrounded by burn marks and patched hull sections and equipment that barely functioned, and she stared into the camera with eyes that had seen too much death. Her voice was steady and clear when she spoke, and every word was chosen carefully to convey exactly the message humanity wanted to send. She told the galaxy that humanity would not be conquered and would not submit to any empire that demanded their surrender. She explained that the Kratheon had come with thousands of ships and threats of extermination, and humanity had answered with fire and ruin and sent them running. Grant made it clear that this was not arrogance or boasting, but simple statement of fact, and that any other power considering attacking Earth should learn from the Empire's mistake. The transmission ended with her looking directly into the camera and saying that humanity was not anyone's prey and would fight to the last breath to remain free. The message was broadcast on every frequency humanity could access, and it reached every corner of explored space within weeks. Some species admired humanity's courage, while others feared what humans might become if they continued developing weapons technology at their current rate. The Kratheon Empire officially denounced the transmission as propaganda, but privately, their military leaders began planning for a future conflict that would require much more careful preparation. Nobody in the Empire's high command wanted to be the one who failed twice against the same primitive species. Dr. Karen Phillips continued her research into advanced weapons systems because she understood that the quantum disruptors had been effective once, but the Kratheon would develop countermeasures for next time. She worked with teams of scientists and engineers who shared her determination to keep humanity ahead of any potential threats, and they developed new technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. Phillips rarely left her laboratory, and she drove her staff hard, but nobody complained because they had all seen what happened when humanity fell behind technologically. Commander Nick Harper spent his recovery time training new fighter pilots to replace the ones lost during the battle. The military academies were flooded with volunteers who wanted to serve after seeing how close Earth had come to defeat, and Harper had his pick of talented young people eager to learn. He taught them everything he knew about combat flying and emphasized the lessons learned from fighting the Kratheon, and made sure they understood that skill and courage could overcome superior technology, but only if you were willing to make the hard choices. 3 months after the battle, Harper was cleared to return to active duty, and he received notification that he had been promoted to squadron commander with responsibility for training all fighter pilots in the Earth Defense Forces. The promotion came with a ceremony that Harper tried to decline because he felt uncomfortable being celebrated when so many of his original squadron had died. His commanding officer told him that honoring the survivors was how humanity remembered the fallen, and Harper reluctantly accepted the medal and the recognition. Sergeant Claire Dawson received a promotion to lieutenant for her actions defending Station 7 during the Kratheon assault. She used her new authority to implement training programs that would better prepare Marines for fighting alien enemies, because the battle had revealed significant gaps in their combat doctrine. Dawson worked with military planners to develop new tactics and equipment specifically designed for boarding actions against non-human vessels, and her recommendations were adopted across the entire defense force. The orbital platforms around Earth were gradually repaired and upgraded with new weapon systems based on lessons learned during the battle. Station 7 received priority repairs because it had suffered the most damage while remaining operational, and the engineers used the reconstruction as an opportunity to completely redesign the defensive layout. Dawson walked through the rebuilt sections and felt satisfaction at seeing how much better prepared they would be if the Kratheon returned. Sullivan took the Vengeance on patrol duty once repairs were complete enough to make the ship space-worthy, and he found that combat experience had transformed his crew into veterans who handled problems calmly that would have panicked them before the battle. Rodriguez had been promoted to full lieutenant and given command of the weapons division, and she ran her department with efficient professionalism. The ship was assigned to patrol the outer system, and watch for any signs of Kratheon scout vessels that might be gathering intelligence for a future attack. Morrison was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given overall command of Earth's military forces with authority to coordinate defense planning across all human colonies. He accepted the responsibility with mixed feelings because he would have preferred to remain with his ship, but he understood that someone needed to organize humanity's military response to future threats. Morrison established his headquarters on Station 7 after it was rebuilt, and he spent his days coordinating strategy with colony leaders and military commanders scattered throughout human space. The Admiral received intelligence reports about other species making contact with humanity for the first time, and these contacts were notably different from previous first contact situations. The new species approached with respect and caution rather than arrogance or threats because they had heard what happened to the Kratheon, and nobody wanted to become the next example of why attacking humans was a bad idea. Morrison met with several alien ambassadors and found that humanity's reputation for ferocity in combat was becoming well established across the galaxy. President Walsh addressed the United Earth Council 6 months after the battle and presented proposals for expanding military production and establishing new defensive positions throughout the solar system. The Council approved every request because nobody wanted to be caught unprepared if another threat emerged. Shipyards that had been destroyed during the battle were rebuilt larger and more capable, and new yards were established on Mars and in the asteroid belt to distribute production capacity. Phillips received unlimited funding for her research programs, and she used the resources to push weapons development forward at an unprecedented pace. Her teams created improved versions of the quantum disruptors that were more stable and more powerful, and they developed new defensive systems that could counter the types of weapons the Kratheon had used. Phillips also began work on faster-than-light drive technology because she believed that humanity needed to be able to project force beyond their home system if they wanted to truly guarantee their security. Harper trained thousands of new pilots in the year following the battle, and his training programs became the model for all combat flight instruction throughout human space. He personally evaluated every graduate and only passed those who demonstrated